The front porch light lay shattered across the concrete steps, like scattered stars, each piece catching the morning sun in ways that made the approaching friends shield their eyes. Something had gone terribly, impossibly wrong at 1717 East Delmar Street. This is the story of how three women vanished so completely that 33 years later, investigators still can't explain what happened in those 5 crucial hours between darkness and dawn. The evening of June 6, 1992, felt like any other graduation night in Springfield, Missouri. 19-year-old Suzie Streeter had just walked across the stage to collect her diploma from Kickapoo High School, her blonde hair still holding the shape of celebration curls beneath her cap. The gymnasium had been thick with the smell of carnations and hairspray, the air electric with that particular energy that comes when teenagers realize childhood is officially over. But before we dive deeper into this mystery, I want to know where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Drop a comment below. I love connecting with viewers across the globe. And if this story grabs you, like it grabbed me, smash that like button and subscribe, because we're just getting started. Suzie's mother, 47-year-old Sherrill Levitt, had skipped the ceremony. She was home on Delmar Street, a quiet residential road lined with modest single-story houses where neighbors still left their doors unlocked and knew each other's middle names. Sherrill was the kind of woman who painted furniture for fun and kept her house spotless, the type who would never leave without making the bed or forget to lock up before bed. That Saturday evening, she'd spent time on the phone with a friend, discussing plans to refinish a chest of drawers. It was the last conversation anyone would ever have with her. Meanwhile, Suzie was navigating the complex social choreography of graduation night with her best friend, 18-year-old Stacy McCall. The girls had spent months planning this evening, cycling through different party options, weighing invitations, trying to maximize their fun while staying safe. They'd settled on attending a gathering at another classmate's house. Nothing too wild, just kids celebrating the end of an era with music and laughter that spilled out onto suburban lawns. The party was everything they'd hoped for. Friends who would soon scatter to different colleges crowded into living rooms, sharing memories and promises to stay in touch. Stacy, with her quick smile and easy laugh, was in her element. Suzie moved through the conversations with the confidence of someone who knew she was loved, someone who had her whole life mapped out ahead of her. They were planning to drive to Branson the next morning for a day at Whitewater, the kind of spontaneous adventure that feels possible when you're 18 and 19, and the summer stretches endlessly ahead. As the clock approached 2:15 a.m., the girls made a decision that would haunt everyone who loved them. Instead of staying over at the party house as originally planned, they decided to drive to Suzie's mother's place on Delmar Street. Maybe they wanted their own space, or maybe they thought Sherrill would appreciate the company. The exact reasoning died with them in those early morning hours. They said their goodbyes, walked out into the humid Missouri night, and climbed into their car. The drive to Delmar Street took less than 10 minutes, straight shots down familiar roads, past the Sonic Drive-In and the gas stations where they'd bought countless sodas and bags of chips over the years. The house would have been dark when they pulled into the driveway, Sherrill likely already asleep after her phone conversation about furniture refinishing. But something was waiting in that darkness, something that would make three women disappear so thoroughly that decades later, their families still set extra places at Christmas dinner, just in case. What happened between 2:15 a.m., when Suzie and Stacy arrived at the house, and 7:30 a.m., when concerned friends would make a discovery that would launch one of Missouri's most perplexing missing persons cases? The answer lies in the details that don't make sense, and in the terrifying realization that sometimes people don't just vanish. Sometimes they're taken. Janelle Kirby's hand froze on the doorknob, her knuckles white against the brass as she realized the front door was unlocked, something that should have been impossible if Sherrill Levitt had any say in the matter. This single detail would become the first crack in what investigators would later call one of the most puzzling crime scenes they'd ever encountered. The morning of June 7th had started normally enough. Janelle and her boyfriend, Mike Henson, were expecting to meet Suzie and Stacy for their planned trip to Branson's Whitewater theme park. When the girls didn't show up at the designated meeting spot, Janelle felt that familiar flutter of concern that comes when reliable friends suddenly become unreliable. Suzie wasn't the type to oversleep or forget plans, especially ones involving a day at the water park they'd been talking about for weeks. So they drove to Delmar Street, pulling into the driveway of the modest ranch-style house where Sherrill had built a quiet life for herself and her daughter. The first thing they noticed was wrong was the broken glass scattered across the front porch shards from the porch-light globe that caught the morning sun like tiny mirrors. The fixture hung empty and somehow ominous in the daylight, its bulb exposed and casting strange shadows. Mike, operating on the logic that broken glass needed to be cleaned up, grabbed a broom from somewhere and swept the evidence away. It was an innocent gesture, the kind of helpful impulse that neighbors have been acting on since the beginning of time. He had no way of knowing that he was potentially destroying crucial evidence, that those glass fragments might have held fingerprints or blood spatter or some other vital clue that could have solved everything. The unlocked door bothered Janelle more than the broken glass. She'd known Sherrill for years, knew her as the type of woman who checked locks twice and left lights on when she was nervous. The house felt wrong somehow, too quiet for a place where three women should have been getting ready for a day of summer fun. She called out as she entered, her voice echoing strangely in rooms that should have been filled with the sounds of blow dryers and morning conversation. Instead, she found a tableau that made no sense. 3 purses sat exactly where they should be, containing the usual debris of women's lives: lipstick, car keys, crumpled receipts, and cash that hadn't been touched. Cigarettes lay on counters where they'd been left. The family dog, a small terrier named Cinnamon, padded around the house in apparent good health, showing no signs of distress or prolonged abandonment. All 3 cars remained in their parking spots, keys hanging on hooks inside the house as if their owners had simply stepped out for a moment and would be right back. But the women were gone. As Janelle moved through the house, trying to make sense of what she was seeing, the phone rang. She answered it reflexively, perhaps hoping to hear Suzie's voice, explaining that they'd gone for early morning coffee, or decided to leave straight from the party. Instead, she heard a male voice saying things that made her stomach clench with fear, obscene suggestions, and threats that seemed to know exactly who she was and why she was there. The phone rang again. Same voice, same sick pleasure in her obvious fear. Janelle hung up quickly, her hands shaking as she tried to process what was happening. Someone knew she was in this house. Someone knew the women were missing. And someone was taking pleasure in her terror. In her panic, she noticed the answering machine was blinking a message, waiting that might hold answers to where everyone had gone. But in her nervous fumbling with the unfamiliar buttons, she accidentally erased it. Whatever information might have been recorded, whatever voice might have provided the key to understanding what happened in those dark hours, was gone forever. The bedroom showed signs that someone had slept in one of the beds, the covers pulled back, and pillows dented with the shape of a head. A window blind hung bent and twisted, as if someone had pushed through it or peered out desperately. But there were no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture or scattered belongings that might indicate a fight. It was this absence of chaos that made everything so unsettling. If 3 women had been taken against their will, wouldn't there be some sign of resistance? Wouldn't someone have knocked over a lamp or left scratch marks on a doorframe? The house felt frozen in time, as if its occupants had simply dissolved into the air. By the time police arrived to secure the scene, Janelle estimated that between 10 and 20 people had walked through the house, friends calling friends, neighbors offering help, family members trying to make sense of the impossible. Each footstep potentially obliterated evidence, each well-meaning gesture possibly destroying the one clue that could have brought the women home. The investigators who finally took control of the scene found themselves facing a mystery that defied every protocol they knew. How do 3 people vanish from a locked house without taking their belongings, their money, or their means of transportation? More importantly, how do they disappear so completely that 33 years later, not a single trace, not a bone, not a piece of clothing, not even a reliable witness has ever been found? The house on Delmar Street had kept its secrets that morning, but the real investigation was just beginning. The phones at Springfield Police Department began ringing before the ink was dry on the first missing persons report, and they wouldn't stop for the next 3 decades. Within hours of the women's disappearance hitting local news, investigators found themselves drowning in a flood of tips, theories, and supposed sightings that would eventually grow to more than 5,000 individual leads, each one demanding follow-up, each one carrying the possibility of being the breakthrough that would bring Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy home. Detective Mike Merritt had worked missing persons cases before, but nothing like this. Most disappearances followed predictable patterns, domestic disputes that escalated, teenagers running away from problems at home, adults walking away from debts or failed relationships. But the Springfield 3 case broke every rule he knew. 3 women, different ages, different life circumstances, vanishing simultaneously from a secure location with no apparent motive and no signs of preparation. The first wave of tips focused on the basics. Had anyone seen the women after 2:15 a.m. on June 7th? Had anyone noticed suspicious vehicles in the neighborhood? Were there any known threats against any of the 3 women? The answers that came back painted a picture of ordinary lives interrupted by something extraordinary and terrifying. Sherrill Levitt was a hairstylist who worked from her home, known for her gentle manner with elderly clients and her meticulous attention to detail. She had no known enemies, no dangerous ex-boyfriends, no involvement in drugs or gambling, or any of the usual complications that draw predators into people's lives. Her biggest concerns seemed to revolve around refinishing furniture and making sure Suzie was ready for college in the fall. Suzie herself was the kind of teenager parents point to as an example: good grades, steady boyfriend, solid group of friends. She worked part-time at a local video store, the kind of job that put her in contact with hundreds of customers, but rarely generated the kind of conflicts that lead to violence. Her future stretched ahead of her like a well-lit highway, college and career and marriage, all waiting in their proper order. Stacy McCall was equally unremarkable in the best possible way. She'd graduated in the top half of her class, planned to attend community college, and spent her free time doing normal 18-year-old things, shopping at the mall, talking on the phone, dreaming about boys and careers, and all the possibilities that come with being young and optimistic. But as the tips poured in, investigators began to realize that ordinary people could become targets simply by being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe the women had witnessed something they shouldn't have seen. Maybe they'd been randomly selected by someone who saw opportunity in their vulnerability. Maybe their disappearance had nothing to do with who they were, and everything to do with when and where they happened to be on that particular night. The breakthrough moment seemed to come on New Year's Eve, 1992, when America's Most Wanted aired a segment about the case. The show had featured the Springfield 3, among other unsolved mysteries, broadcasting their photos and details to millions of viewers across the country. The response was immediate and overwhelming, with calls flooding in from people who claimed to have seen the women or knew something about their disappearance. But one call stood out from all the others. The caller claimed to have prime knowledge about what had happened to the 3 women, not just a sighting or a theory, but actual inside information about their fate. The voice on the line was confident, specific, and chilling in its certainty. This wasn't someone guessing or looking for attention. This was someone who knew something real. Detective Merritt felt his pulse quicken as he listened to the dispatcher relay the information. This could be it, the call they'd been waiting for, the voice that would finally explain how 3 women could vanish so completely from a locked house in a quiet neighborhood. The caller was being transferred to the police line, just moments away from potentially solving one of Missouri's most baffling mysteries. Then the line went dead. Whether the caller got cold feet, lost service, or was interrupted by someone else, investigators would never know. The connection was gone, and with it went what might have been their best chance at understanding what happened during those crucial hours on Delmar Street. Attempts to trace the call led nowhere. Cellular technology in 1992 was primitive compared to today's standards, and anonymous tips from payphones were nearly impossible to track. The missed opportunity haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Somewhere out there was a person who knew exactly what had happened to Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy. Someone who had watched the America's Most Wanted segment and felt compelled to share what they knew, only to disappear back into anonymity at the crucial moment. As 1993 began, investigators found themselves facing a sobering reality. Despite thousands of tips, hundreds of interviews, and countless hours of investigation, they were no closer to solving the case than they'd been on that first morning when Janelle Kirby found the broken glass on the front porch. The women had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed at all. But someone, somewhere, knew the truth about what happened in those dark hours between night and dawn. The question was whether that person would ever find the courage to speak again, or if the secret of the Springfield 3 would remain buried forever in the silence of that disconnected call. The shovel hit something solid 18 inches below the Missouri clay, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, investigators allowed themselves to hope they'd finally found what remained of the Springfield 3. This was April 2003, 11 years after the disappearance, and the case had taken on a life of its own, spawning theories, attracting amateur detectives, and generating leads that sent investigators racing across multiple states in pursuit of answers that always seemed to slip away at the last moment. The farmland south of Cassville had seemed promising when the tip came in. Rural property, isolated enough for someone to dispose of evidence without being seen, owned by people with connections to some of the shadier characters who'd floated through the investigation over the years. When ground-penetrating radar suggested anomalies beneath the soil, investigators obtained warrants and assembled a team for what they hoped would be the excavation that finally brought closure to 3 families who'd been living in limbo for more than a decade. What they found in the dirt that day was both tantalizing and heartbreaking. There was indeed blood enough to send samples to the state crime lab for analysis. Mixed in with the soil was a fragment of green vehicle paint, the kind of detail that could tie everything together if it matched evidence from the original crime scene. For a few weeks, investigators allowed themselves to believe they'd finally caught the break they'd been praying for. The lab results crushed those hopes with clinical efficiency. The blood was animal, not human. The paint fragment, while interesting, couldn't be definitively connected to any vehicle involved in the case. Once again, what had seemed like a breakthrough dissolved into another dead end, another false alarm, in a case that had already produced far too many of both. But the Cassville dig represented something larger than just one more failed lead. By 2003, the Springfield 3 case had become a magnet for every conspiracy theory, amateur sleuth, and attention-seeking tipster in the Midwest. People called with dreams they'd had about the women. Psychics offered their services. Prisoners looking for reduced sentences claimed knowledge they didn't possess. Each lead demanded investigation. Each theory required precious resources. And each disappointment pushed the families deeper into despair. The most persistent theory centered around a moss green Dodge van that multiple witnesses claimed to have seen in the area around the time of the disappearance. The vehicle had been spotted near Delmar Street in the early morning hours of June 7th, driven by someone who seemed nervous or agitated. Other sightings placed it at various locations around Springfield in the days following the disappearance, always with the same description: older model van, distinctive green color, often seen parked in unusual places or moving through neighborhoods where it didn't belong. Investigators spent thousands of hours tracking down every green van in a 3-state area, interviewing owners, checking maintenance records, following paper trails that stretched back years. They found plenty of green vans, but none that could be definitively connected to the disappearance. The vehicle became almost mythical in the case files, always just out of reach, always one step ahead of the investigators who were trying to catch up with it. The most controversial lead emerged in 2007, when ground-penetrating radar was used to scan the parking garage beneath Cox South Hospital. The technology had advanced significantly since the early days of the investigation, and when 3 human-sized anomalies showed up on the scans, buried beneath concrete that had been poured in September 1993, just months after the disappearance, the discovery sent shockwaves through the law enforcement community. The timing was impossible to ignore. The parking garage had been constructed during the exact period when someone might have been looking for a permanent place to dispose of evidence. Concrete was the perfect medium for hiding bodies it sealed in odors, prevented scavenging animals from disturbing remains, and created a barrier that could last for decades. If someone had wanted to make 3 women disappear forever, they could hardly have chosen a better location. But Springfield Police Department declined to authorize excavation. The official reasoning cited lack of credible evidence connecting the anomalies to the missing women, the enormous cost of tearing up a functioning parking garage, and the disruption it would cause to hospital operations. Unofficially, investigators worried about what they might find, or worse, what they might not find. Another expensive, high-profile search that yielded nothing would be devastating to department morale and public confidence. The decision sparked outrage among the families and amateur investigators who'd been following the case. How could police refuse to excavate when 3 potential bodies had been detected beneath concrete poured at exactly the right time? What if the Springfield 3 were literally beneath the feet of hospital patients and staff, waiting to be discovered, waiting to finally come home? The controversy highlighted a painful truth about long-running missing persons cases. Every lead demanded resources that departments didn't have. Every search risked another devastating disappointment. And every decision not to pursue a particular theory left investigators wondering if they'd just passed up their best chance to solve the case. As the years stretched on, the Springfield 3 began to take on an almost legendary quality in Missouri law enforcement circles. Veteran detectives would brief new officers about the case, passing down institutional knowledge about leads that had been followed and theories that had been tested. The case files grew thicker. The evidence boxes multiplied, but the central mystery remained as impenetrable as ever. Somewhere in those thousands of tips and hundreds of interviews lay the key to understanding what happened on Delmar Street. But finding that key meant separating genuine leads from attention-seeking false alarms, credible witnesses from people seeking their 15 minutes of fame. The question wasn't whether someone knew what had happened to Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy. The question was whether investigators would recognize the truth when they finally heard it, and whether it would come in time to matter. Robert Craig Cox sat in his prison cell, serving time for an unrelated kidnapping, when investigators arrived with questions about 3 missing women from Springfield, and his reaction told them everything they needed to know about the kind of man they were dealing with. The challenge with a case like the Springfield 3 isn't finding suspects. It's narrowing down a list that seems to grow longer with each passing year. Each new theory, each desperate attempt to make sense of the senseless. Cox had inserted himself into the investigation early, calling police with unsolicited tips and theories about what might have happened to the women. This kind of behavior, criminals inserting themselves into ongoing investigations, was textbook stuff that seasoned detectives recognized immediately. Sometimes, Perpetrators got a thrill from watching investigators chase false leads they'd provided. Sometimes they wanted to gauge how close police were getting to the truth, and sometimes they simply couldn't resist the urge to be part of the story they'd created. When investigators dug deeper into Cox's background, they found a pattern that made their blood run cold. He had a history of targeting women, using violence and intimidation to control his victims. His previous kidnapping conviction involved elaborate planning and a chilling disregard for human life. More troubling still were the similarities between his known methods and the mysterious circumstances surrounding the Springfield disappearances. Women taken from secure locations, no signs of struggle, no obvious motive beyond opportunity and evil intent. But Cox wasn't the only name generating interest in investigative circles. Dustin Rekla had been involved in a bizarre incident involving damage to a mausoleum, and some theorists suggested that the Springfield 3 disappearance might have been retaliation for that case. The logic was convoluted. Someone angry about mausoleum damage, targeting 3 innocent women who had nothing to do with the original incident, but in a case where nothing made conventional sense, even far-fetched theories demanded investigation. The Rekla connection highlighted one of the most frustrating aspects of the case. Every person who'd had even tangential contact with any of the 3 women became a potential suspect. Every minor crime or unusual incident in the months leading up to the disappearance was scrutinized for possible connections. Investigators found themselves chasing leads that branched and multiplied like fractals, each one spawning 3 more theories that demanded precious time and resources. Larry Dwayne Hall presented perhaps the most chilling possibility of all. Hall was a confirmed serial killer, with a preference for young women and a geographical range that included Missouri. His method of operation, approaching victims in parking lots or isolated areas, overpowering them quickly before they could alert others, could theoretically explain how 3 women might vanish simultaneously without leaving obvious signs of struggle. Hall had been active during the time period when the Springfield 3 disappeared, and investigators found tantalizing connections between his known locations and the areas where the women had been that night. But Hall, like many serial killers, was a master of misdirection, who gave different versions of events depending on his audience and his mood. When questioned about the Springfield case, he provided information that was sometimes startlingly accurate and sometimes completely fabricated, leaving investigators unable to determine whether he was confessing or simply playing psychological games. The problem with multiple viable suspects was that it prevented investigators from focusing their limited resources on any single theory. Each potential perpetrator demanded thorough investigation, background checks, timeline verification, witness interviews, physical evidence analysis. The case files grew to include dozens of persons of interest, each with their own folder of reports, tips, and investigative summaries. Some suspects emerged from the original crime scene evidence. The obscene phone calls that Janelle Kirby had received suggested someone who knew the women were missing and took pleasure in terrorizing their friends. This pointed towards someone with intimate knowledge of the disappearance, either the perpetrator himself or someone close enough to the crime to know details that hadn't been released to the public. Other suspects came from the thousands of tips that continued pouring in year after year. Former boyfriends, disgruntled customers from Sherrill's hair salon, people who'd had minor conflicts with any of the 3 women, all became part of an ever-expanding web of investigation that seemed to grow more complex rather than more focused as time went on. The media attention surrounding the case both helped and hindered the investigation. Television shows like Disappeared and People magazine Investigates brought national attention to the Springfield 3, generating new tips and keeping the case in public consciousness. Podcasts dedicated to the case attracted passionate amateur detectives who pored over every available detail, sometimes uncovering connections that professional investigators had missed. But media coverage also attracted the kind of attention that complicated investigations. Self-appointed experts emerged with elaborate theories about what had happened. Social media groups formed around different suspect theories, sometimes generating harassment campaigns against people whose only crime was living in Springfield during the summer of 1992. The case had become larger than the three women it was supposed to be about. It had spawned books, documentaries, and countless online discussions. It had become a touchstone for people fascinated by unsolved mysteries, a puzzle that seemed solvable if only the right person looked at it from the right angle. But for the families of Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy, all the theories and suspects and media attention couldn't fill the holes left by 3 empty chairs at every holiday dinner, 3 missing voices in every family conversation. Somewhere in that gallery of suspects was the person responsible for the Springfield 3 disappearance. The question was whether investigators would identify him before time and fading memories made justice impossible, or whether the truth would remain buried as deeply as the women themselves. 33 years later, Springfield still holds its breath every time a construction crew breaks ground, every time road work uncovers something unexpected, every time someone calls the police about bones found in a creek bed or clothes discovered in an abandoned building. The psychological weight of unsolved disappearance doesn't just affect the immediate families. It seeps into the groundwater of entire communities, changing how people think about safety, trust, and the fundamental assumption that bad things happen to other people in other places. Drive through Springfield today, and you'll find a city that has grown and modernized, where new shopping centers and apartment complexes have sprouted around the edges of what was once a smaller, simpler place. But longtime residents carry the Springfield 3 case with them like a chronic ache, a reminder that evil can strike randomly and completely, leaving behind nothing but questions that multiply rather than resolve with the passage of time. The house on Delmar Street has changed hands several times since 1992. Each new owner inevitably learns the history from neighbors who remember, who point out where the broken glass was found, who share theories about what might have happened in those early morning hours. Some owners embrace the notoriety, treating their home's dark history as an interesting conversation starter. Others find the weight of the mystery oppressive, eventually selling and moving somewhere without ghosts in the walls. For Sherrill's family, Suzie's family, and Stacy's family, the passage of time has brought no relief, no closure, no gradual acceptance that sometimes people disappear and are never found. Instead, it has brought the peculiar torture of hope-deferred phone calls from investigators who think they've found something, media coverage that resurrects painful memories, well-meaning strangers who approach them in grocery stores with new theories about what might have happened to their loved ones. The anniversary of June 7, 1992, arrives each year like a scheduled wound. Local media outlets run retrospective stories about the case. Social media groups dedicated to the Springfield 3 experience surges of activity. Amateur investigators share their latest theories, and the families endure another year of being the central figures in a mystery they would give anything to solve. Janice McCall, Stacy's mother, has become an accidental expert on missing persons cases, learning the terminology of investigations, understanding the jurisdictional complications that can hamper searches across state lines, developing relationships with other families who've lost children to unexplained disappearances. She attends conferences where parents share strategies for keeping cold cases alive, where they trade techniques for working with media and maintaining pressure on law enforcement agencies that might otherwise move on to more solvable crimes. The case has spawned its own ecosystem of amateur investigators, podcast hosts, and social media sleuths who treat the Springfield 3 like a puzzle to be solved rather than a tragedy that destroyed multiple families. Some of these amateur detectives have contributed genuine insights, uncovering connections that professional investigators missed, or bringing fresh perspectives to evidence that had been examined countless times. Others have caused harm, harassing innocent people who became suspects through proximity or bad timing, spreading theories that had no basis in fact. Technology has transformed the investigation in ways that would have seemed like science fiction in 1992. DNA analysis can now extract profiles from microscopic samples that would have been useless 30 years ago. Cell phone data can track movements with precision that makes alibis almost impossible to fake. Social media has created digital trails that persist long after people think they've deleted them. But the Springfield 3 disappeared in an analog world, where evidence was primarily physical, where communication happened through landline phones and face-to-face conversations, where someone could vanish without leaving electronic footprints. The very completeness of their disappearance suggests careful planning by someone who understood how to avoid detection in an era before digital surveillance became ubiquitous. Recent years have brought new attention to the case through podcasts and documentary series that have introduced the Springfield 3 to audiences who weren't alive when the disappearance happened. These productions have generated thousands of new tips, some from people who were children in 1992, but are now adults with adult perspectives on things they witnessed. Others come from people who've heard family stories about suspicious behavior or unusual activities during that summer. The challenge for investigators is separating legitimate leads from the noise generated by increased media attention. Every Netflix documentary about unsolved mysteries brings a new wave of tips from people who think they've spotted crucial details that everyone else missed. Every podcast episode generates emails from listeners who are certain they've identified the real perpetrator. Most of these tips lead nowhere, but investigators can't afford to ignore them. The one genuine lead might be buried among hundreds of false alarms. The Springfield Police Department has assigned new detectives to the case as older ones retired, creating an institutional challenge around preserving knowledge and maintaining continuity. Each new investigator has to learn the case from scratch, reviewing thousands of pages of reports, understanding the complex web of suspects and theories, building relationships with families who've been disappointed too many times to trust easily. Technology companies have offered to apply artificial intelligence to the case files, using machine learning algorithms to identify patterns that human investigators might have missed. Cold case units from other jurisdictions have shared techniques for using genetic genealogy to identify suspects from minimal DNA evidence. The FBI has provided updated psychological profiles based on 3 decades of research into similar crimes. But for all the technological advances and investigative innovations, the central mystery remains as impenetrable as ever. 3 women walked into a house on Delmar Street and never walked out. Someone knows what happened to them. Someone knows where they are. The question is whether that person is still alive, still in a position to tell the truth, still capable of being reached by investigators who refuse to give up on a case that has defined their careers and shaped their understanding of how evil operates in the world. Springfield keeps waiting for answers that may never come, holding space for 3 women who may never come home. In a storage room at Springfield Police Department, boxes containing 33 years of evidence sit waiting for the phone call that will make everything matter. The call from someone ready to tell the truth about what happened to 3 women who trusted the wrong person on the Saunas. Wrong night. The Springfield 3 case has become more than just an unsolved mystery. It's become a testament to the enduring power of questions that refuse to be forgotten, families that refuse to stop hoping, and investigators who refuse to accept that some puzzles simply can't be solved. Detective Neil McAmis inherited the case files in 2018, becoming the latest in a long line of investigators who've stared at crime scene photographs, read witness statements, and tried to find the thread that will unravel everything. He approaches the evidence with fresh eyes, but carries the weight of 3 decades worth of false hopes and dead ends. Every new tip that comes in could be the breakthrough, but experience has taught him to manage expectations while never losing sight of the ultimate goal, bringing Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy home. The families have learned to live with uncertainty in ways that most people can't imagine. They've celebrated birthdays for women who may no longer be alive to celebrate them. They've held on to Christmas stockings and graduation photos, maintaining shrines to people whose fate they may never know. The not knowing is its own form of torture, worse than grief, because grief allows for acceptance and healing, while uncertainty keeps wounds perpetually fresh. Janice McCall still answers her phone on the first ring, hoping it might be the call she's been waiting 33 years to receive. She's moved multiple times since 1992, but she makes sure the Springfield Police Department always has her current number. She's outlived some of the original investigators on the case, watched as new technologies emerged and new theories were tested, maintained hope through disappointments that would have broken most people. The psychological impact of the Springfield 3 disappearance extends far beyond the immediate families. It changed how an entire generation of parents in Springfield thought about their children's safety. Sleepovers that once seemed harmless became occasions for anxiety. Graduation parties were monitored more closely. The casual trust that allows teenagers to make spontaneous decisions about where to spend the night evaporated, replaced by the knowledge that 3 responsible young women had made one simple decision that cost them everything. Crime scene experts who've studied the case continue to be puzzled by its unique characteristics. Most abductions leave some trace disturbed soil, tire tracks, witness sightings, physical evidence. The Springfield 3 vanished so completely that it's almost as if they never existed, as if that night in June 1992 was erased from reality. The absence of evidence has become evidence itself, suggesting a level of planning and execution that's rare, even among experienced criminals. Modern investigators have applied contemporary understanding of criminal psychology to the case, developing profiles that wouldn't have been possible in 1992. They know they're looking for someone with intimate knowledge of the victim's routines, someone comfortable enough in their neighborhood to operate without drawing attention, someone capable of controlling 3 people simultaneously. These insights have narrowed the field of potential suspects, while simultaneously highlighting how sophisticated this crime was. The advent of genetic genealogy has brought new hope to cold cases across the country, using DNA evidence to identify suspects decades after their crimes were committed. Investigators continue to test trace evidence from the Delmar Street house, hoping that advancing technology will finally extract usable genetic profiles from samples that were too degraded or too small to analyze using older methods. Each technological breakthrough brings the possibility that the Springfield 3 case might finally move from the unsolved column to the closed column. Social media has created new avenues for information to surface. People who were children in 1992 are now adults with their own children, viewing their childhood memories through different lenses. Family secrets that seemed unimportant at the time have taken on new significance. Deathbed confessions have been shared with adult children who suddenly realize they might possess information relevant to one of Missouri's most famous mysteries. But social media has also complicated the investigation, creating echo chambers where theories multiply and evolve without regard for facts or evidence. Amateur detectives have identified dozens of potential suspects, sometimes ruining innocent people's lives based on nothing more than geographic proximity to Springfield in 1992. The democratization of information has both helped and hindered the search for truth. The Springfield 3 case has influenced how law enforcement agencies handle missing persons investigations. The contamination of the crime scene at Delmar Street has become a cautionary tale taught at police academies across the country. The importance of securing scenes immediately, of treating every unexplained absence as potentially criminal, of preserving evidence even when it seems insignificant. These lessons were learned at the cost of 3 women's lives. Today, as Springfield continues to grow and change, the case remains an open wound in the community's collective memory. New residents learn about the Springfield 3 from neighbors and coworkers. Longtime residents still lock their doors more carefully, still feel a chill when they drive past the house on Delmar Street, still wonder if they've encountered the person responsible without knowing it. The truth about what happened on June 7, 1992, exists somewhere in the world. Someone knows where Sherrill, Suzie, and Stacy are. Someone carries the weight of 3 murders, 3 families destroyed, 3 decades of lies and silence. That person may be in prison for other crimes, may be living a seemingly normal life in another state, may be dead themselves, taking the secret to their grave. But until that truth emerges, Springfield will continue to hold space for 3 women who deserved better than to become legends, who deserved to live their lives instead of becoming cautionary tales, who deserved to come home. The Springfield 3 case stands as proof that some mysteries endure not because they can't be solved, but because someone has chosen not to solve them. Somewhere in the silence lies the key to everything, waiting for courage or conscience, or time to finally turn it. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even stranger. Subscribe before it drops.